Greetings, everyone. We're the board members of the Museums Association of the Caribbean, and we're pleased to welcome you to MAC's 31st conference.
This year's theme is Cultivating Resilience in Museums and Cultural Heritage Sites, a topic that couldn't be more relevant after the past 18 months.
Pandemic, earthquake, hurricane, our regions have seen it all, and we've also survived it all.
Our over 50 presenters will be sharing with you how they've managed to survive, what sustainability means for them, and the challenges they still continue to face.
But it's not all about the struggle. It wouldn't be a MAC conference without the chance to socialize, network, and even share a drink or two.
Join us live. Join us live at the Mix and Sips to learn how to make a Caribbean cocktail, enjoy a museum tour or a cultural performance.
Or attend our lunchtime food presentations, where culinary experts share with us how Caribbean food is also a source of resilience and sustainability.
And if you're brand new to the MAC conference, we encourage you to attend and connect with us through the speed networking sessions and the session chats.
And if you've been with us before, reconnect with us and past attendees through the private chat feature in FeedLoop.
This is our first virtual conference, and it's definitely been a learning curve.
As always, tell us what worked and didn't work for you in the conference surveys. But most of all, have a great time.
Passez un bon moment.
Que lo disfruten.
Rappelez-y, Bocanté et Pinou.
Welcome again, everyone. I'm Joanne Hippolyte, MAC's board president, and it is my distinct pleasure to serve on the board with that wonderful cast of people you just saw. It's my absolute pleasure to open the 31st MAC conference today. This conference is definitely one for the books. It's MAC's first virtual conference. It's the first time we're not gathered physically together, as we usually are, but we also have the largest number of registered attendees in our conference history. That's over 170 plus attendees and presenters from over 30 countries, with representation from the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, and the English Caribbean, and its far-flung diasporas in the United States, Canada, Europe, and more. Over the course of the next 2.5 days, you'll have the option of a blend of over 23 pre-recorded and live sessions to attend. All of them address our theme of cultivating resilience in museums and cultural heritage sites. The shared impact of the pandemic on the Caribbean and Caribbean interest museums and their staff clearly influenced the choice of this year's theme. MAC's primary efforts since the global onset of the pandemic in early 2020 have been directed towards documenting and evaluating this impact, as well as providing opportunities for training and sharing. Our tagline for the 2021 conference, brilliantly worded by planning team member Amanda Colson, asks, what does museum and cultural work look like in an age where we are focused on how to survive, while we must also consider how to thrive? This conference answers that question, both through the technology grounding its delivery and our ability to gather, and through the very many valuable resources, stories, and reminders shared by over 60 presenters and speakers. Some of them are sharing with us new projects and interpretive challenges. Others evaluate past, present, and ongoing traumas. Some sessions remind us that the pandemic is not by far their region's first crisis, nor is the critical subject of sustainability and resilience new to the museum and cultural heritage sector. In many different ways, we or our ancestors have all been here before, and out of these past experiences have already forged our resilience. But there are new lessons to be learned from each of these moments and old ones to be reminded of. And we're at our best when we can learn from each other. This is ultimately why the MAC conference and the network and its network of museum and cultural heritage professionals exists. When we realized we wouldn't be able to host the conference in person this year, as planned in the Bahamas, our conference hosts generously agreed to welcome us next year in the Bahamas in 2022. For the first year in our history, MAC has no one nation or national host. Instead, a number of institutions that are part of our MAC family and some new ones stepped in to support. Without these partners and sponsors, this conference would not have been possible. On behalf of the organization, I express our copious thanks and appreciation to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Central Bank of the Bahamas, the National Gallery of the Bahamas, the National Gallery of the Cayman Islands, the Society of the Friends of the West Indian Museum of Panama, Local Voices, Reggae Chefs, the House of Angostura, Bird Creations, the National Museum of Bermuda, the University of West Indies Museum, and the Collectivité Territoriale de Martinique. I also want to extend our thanks to the Conference Planning Committee, which was composed of an amazing team of volunteers, contractors, board and general members from over 10 different countries. They put an exhausting number of hours and an amazing amount of brain power and creativity into making this conference happen. Many of them will be in the background of all the sessions and troubleshooting any technological issues, as well as answering your questions throughout the programs. And now for the main event of this program. During the opening session of each MAC conference, we're usually treated to a keynote address reflecting on the theme of the conference in each speaker's unique way. We are particularly thrilled to have noted architect and educator Mark Raymond with us, fulfilling this role today. To give him a proper introduction, I'm inviting MAC board member Alex Martinez Suarez back to the virtual stage.
Thank you, Joanne, and good afternoon, everyone. As a Caribbean architect and also as a MAC board member, it is a great pleasure to introduce an admired colleague that honors us this afternoon as keynote speaker. Professor Mark Raymond is a graduate of London Architectural Association School of Architecture, AA, and Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology practice-based PhD program. He's currently the director of the Graduate School of Architecture at the University of Johannesburg, Africa's largest dedicated postgraduate or architecture school. He recently served as the PLIM Distinguished Visiting Professor at the Illinois School of Architecture at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Mark has extensive international experience in both practice and architectural education. After graduating from the AA, he worked in Europe for practices including Conrad, Norman Foster, Ulrich Brandy, and DEGW, before returning to Port of Spain, Trinidad, where his practice embraced a wide range of architectural and urban design planning commissions throughout the Caribbean. He has combined his practice with writing, teaching, lecturing, and design research. He is committed to the effective engagement of design pedagogy through practice and research with process of transformation and social justice. Mark, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you very much, Joanne, for your kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be able to join you today. Let me put this on the theme of your conference is quite a challenging one. It covers a lot of different issues and themes that interest me. But it's really a great honor and a great pleasure to be able to be part of your community today. I'm in South Africa. It's quite late in the evening here at the moment. It's past 9 o'clock. I think on your side of the world, it's the middle of the afternoon, but I've really been looking forward to this event. And I'd like to thank the organizers for their generosity, first in advising me, and then the wonderful way that this has all been organized. I think as we navigate our way through Zoom and Team, it can be quite tiresome, but I think we're all getting quite good at it. And this experience so far seems to suggest that your association has certainly developed some real expertise, and I hope that I can do it justice in my presentation. So I'm really today going to just try and share some thoughts that I have after I'd heard about the theme and the title of your conference, Cultivating Resilience in Museums and Cultural Heritage Sites. I thought about how those ideas intersected with what I do, both as an architect as well as a researcher and as an educator. And of course, the idea of resilience, I think, understandably, is something that's very important within architecture. The idea of museums, the museum is a critical typology within architecture, and it's been the subject of considerable reflection in recent years, particularly with the advent of digital and virtual experiences. What does a museum mean? How can a museum work? Culture is important, and importantly, the idea of heritage, I think, is a really interesting idea. And I think certainly in my experience, heritage certainly conjured up, or has conjured up in the past, the idea of history, the idea of something that is in the past. And I think implicit in that word is the idea of something that has happened, something that has occurred before. But I'm also acutely aware, certainly within the nature of my own practice, and I would call myself, I think until recently, I would have called myself a modern architect. I think I'd probably call myself a recovering modernist at the moment. But certainly the idea of heritage in relation to contemporary production is a really interesting one. And the fact that each moment that we live, this moment very soon will constitute a history. It will constitute a form of heritage, collective heritage. And how we collate that, how we imagine that, I think is really important. And certainly within my field of architecture is primarily concerned with projecting, with making a proposition for what happens in the future. And that might be, or it might constitute propositions that embrace the past. And it strikes me that in the field that many of the participants of this conference are engaged in, that your work is largely addressing the past, but in a sense trying to bring the past into the present and into our understanding of the future. So I'm interested in this intersection, this idea of embracing the past in order to understand the future, or in order to understand the future, having to understand what has happened before. And how does that situate itself within practice? And how do we anticipate, how do we look ahead in terms of how we configure spaces, conceptual or spatial spaces in the future? How do we configure that imaginary? How do we anticipate the memory of the current moment? And I've tried to, through some different examples of areas of research that interest me, projects that I've been involved with or that I'm aware of, tried to touch upon this sort of curious space as to where architecture meets the idea of heritage and cultural heritage. This is a building that I had a lot to do with many years ago. Shortly after I graduated, I worked with the German designer Ulrike Brandy in Hamburg, and she was part of the team that was working on the restoration and renovation of this building in Paris. It's the Musée du Zoologie and the Jardin des Plantes, and it was one of the last of President Mitterrand's Grand Travaux. series of sort of large-scale public or civic cultural projects that the French president commissioned in France in the late 80s and early 90s. And it represents a building of a particular time, of a particular order, of a particular understanding. It's a building that was constructed at the height of French colonial enterprise in the 19th century, and it housed in it a substantial collection of animals, of stuffed animals that I imagine French colonists had sort of gathered from different parts of the world, and must have in Paris at the middle of the 19th century been really quite a fantastic phenomenon to behold. And the building had fallen into disrepair. And the project we worked on was to restore the building and renovate it and bring it back to life as a zoological museum. And the architects who were the primary architects of the project, Chematov and Huidobro, worked with the French scenographer René Alliot. They used somebody from film to conceptualize how they would fit out the interior of the building. And this is the finished interior. And what was really fascinating with the concept was that rather than restoring the building to precisely its former use, to replacing all of the animals and all the artifacts in their original places, in the original schema, the building was taken sort of reappropriated, recolonized as a shell. The animals, sent off to taxidermists and, reconditioned, but reintroduced into the space as if it were a natural habitat. So if you look on the left of that image, you can see the vitrines that used to house all of the exhibits, the smaller exhibits, but were left as artifacts themselves, and the animals occupy the space as if they're encountering a kind of natural landscape. And firstly, it was a very exciting project to be part of, but secondly, and most importantly, it left in me a really compelling idea, which is the idea of how spatial design can intersect with the idea of museography and the idea of exhibit and the idea of history to transform the experience of it. And a building that really represented, a colonial era was transformed into quite an exciting and vibrant place. And it made me think how sometimes we are conditioned by views or ideas that can sometimes restrict or constrain our understanding of the present or the future, but that in fact there's a great deal of richness and depth in reconsidering and reinterpreting what we see as given in new ways. And in the Caribbean, and a lot of the references I'm going to share with you today are from Trinidad, but I think the stories and the narratives that lie underneath them are stories and narratives that I think are very relevant throughout the Caribbean. And I've tried to fashion my talk in that way. So whilst as I said, they might be from Trinidad or Tobago, I think they have a relevance that extend beyond that. So I was lucky enough a few years ago to work with my very good friend and colleague, the Trinidadian photographer Abigail Hadid, on a project called Record Art Memory. And Abigail curated this project, and I helped her. And we tried to look at the archive of photographs, and we tried to dig up kind of the archive of photographs that exist in various places in Trinidad to try to kind of evoke or to understand primarily the value of photography as a means of recording society and recording and capturing the idea of memory in public space and in public life. And the photographs themselves as artifacts are really absolutely fascinating and interesting. But I think for me, what they did was they showed me how my traditional reading of history in Trinidad and the Caribbean, and this goes back from when I was a student, when I was trying to find literature and information in London that would explain to me the contemporary condition of Caribbean cities and contemporary condition of Caribbean architecture. But all I could really find were images of colonial architecture, which was not of particular interest to me. I was interested in the contemporary or the modern life of the city, but there seemed to be so little information about that. And these photographs, I think, provided a really interesting narrative and a story about Caribbean life and about a kind of heritage. But because of the nature of the medium, because of the immediacy of the photograph, I felt a kind of great proximity to the spaces and to the places and to the people that occupied the spaces that many of which I was familiar with. This is in Scarborough, in Tobago. I know this road very well. So these places and spaces that come alive in the photographs really resonated as we sort of uncovered a whole range of really exceptional photographs. This one of Marine Square, now Independence Square. And one can see from the clothes that people are wearing, one can see from the structures of the buildings, the way that the streets are used. There's a whole sort of value and culture that is evoked in the imagery that I think sometimes is a separate kind of experience or memory from the kind of inscribed colonial experience that often one gets from texts or the traditional repositories where the memory of the city or the memory of the place are often kept. And it's this relationship between the representation of history within museums, within the conventional tropes of cultural heritage. It's a relationship between the modalities of that and the spatial modalities and the spatial experience and the spatial memories, I think, that I find really quite interesting and compelling in the way that they can very potently convey specific and particular values about places. And there's something about this that I think speaks to a kind of resilience that, in a way, the richer or the more profound that record can be, and the experience of moments in time can be, the more authentic, in a way, the evocation of heritage can be, the more relevant it can be from the present. And also, I think, speaks to us as to how we might record or capture what is happening now for future posterity. Again, this notional idea that the moments that we are in now, the activities that we perform now, the spaces that we occupy now, and the spaces that we design now will at some point constitute in and of themselves forms of heritage. This is a detail from painting by Michel Jean Casabon, and you can see this painting was it's a painting of the waterfront in Port of Spain, the St. Vincent Wharf, in the middle of the 19th century or the early part of the 19th century. And you can see the simple form and structure of the buildings, and the fact that painting or the view or the recording that Michel Jean Casabon did of the landscape can be really very valuable in conjuring or evoking the sense or the qualities of the spaces that existed at the time. And we can see here in this next image, this next image, which is a view from Laventil down looking west towards the Port of Spain. We can see the project of reclamation that took place in the waterfront, which is what is known as South Quay. The large clumps of trees on the right is Marine Square, what is now Independence Square. And then on the left, where the land is reclaimed, you can see a little train there, which is going into where the railway station is, and the waterfront at South Quay. And the lighthouse and the ships that speak to the trade that was taking place and the burgeoning trade that was taking place in Trinidad at the time. Another, I think, really valuable example of something that we might look at. We might look at this painting as an historical artifact that record or contains or is a repository of history, but it also represented what was happening at that moment. It was, in a sense, a kind of sort of, it was news, it was information about that moment. And in this case, really, really very valuable information about the form and the space of the city and how the city was growing and how it was growing at a particular pace and how it was developing particular types of infrastructure, how the sort of existential reality of the city and the needs of this colonial outpost were constituting in and of themselves new forms and new ways of inhabiting the landscape. Not in a nostalgic way. We don't need to look at this picture in a nostalgic way. We can look at it as information, as very valuable information about what at the time was a contemporary moment. And moving on to the next image, which is another image by Casabon. of Marine Square in Port of Spain, which again reveals so much information about what was happening at that particular moment in time. The architecture, the form, the scale, the nature of the architecture. We can see the materiality of the architecture, the stone bases on which the buildings were constructed, the timber construction, the use of stereotomic construction, of stone construction in the sacred architecture, and the way that the space was used, the way that landscape was integrated into the form of the city, all really very valuable ideas and notions about the space that reinforce and contribute to our understanding of what we might look back at now and see as a stage or a moment in history, but represents a capturing at that time of an event, of a spatial event and experience. And a number of Caribbean architects have engaged with different ways of understanding this, and notably Jacques Berthelot, the Guadeloupean architect, with this really absolutely seminal and critical text, Casantier, which was produced in the 1980s, and Jacques Berthelot with Martine Gomez produced really a phenomenal study of Caribbean architecture that rather than looking at the traditional colonial structures, looked at the sort of common dwelling, the habitual common dwelling, firstly in Guadeloupe, and then the French Caribbean, and then expanding to throughout the Caribbean, and trying to understand how structures were made, the techniques by which they were made, how those structures responded to the different cultural and climatic conditions that existed or prevailed at the time, at different locations in the Caribbean, and producing a really quite extraordinary typology and series of typologies where in each island, Berthelot and Gomez would produce these drawings of these typical forms, that are all simple dwellings, but modified by climate, modified by the availability of materials, modified by a whole range of pragmatic conditions that informed the peculiarities of the landscape where the buildings existed. It's a lovely essay in architectural typology, but it also represents this kind of search for an understanding of an authenticity. So again, we look at these buildings and we see them as historical, as traditional, but they can actually become a very valuable and useful ciphers or ways of understanding the contemporary landscape. And these buildings, in fact, apart from these drawings, represent not only a useful documentation of a historical architecture, but they also represent really interesting studies in how architecture responds climatically in an instinctive way to climate and the needs of human occupation. John Newell-Lewis, the British Trinidadian architect who produced a very interesting book called A Jupa, produced this lovely, and this is an illustration from a jupa, which shows the evolution of architectural form in Trinidad before 1883 and after 1883. And he relates this sort of critical moment to the introduction of the mechanical band saw, the ability to use a mechanical device, an industrially generated device, to be able to fashion timber. And it's this moment at which two things happen. One is the bandsaw allowed far more elaborate decoration for houses, and you be familiar with gingerbread houses in Haiti and in Trinidad at this time, that really capitalized and exploited upon the engagement of the bandsaw to create this filigree work and this detail work that in a way was work that was trying to kind of emulate the moldings and the forms of the classical entablatures and orders of classical architecture that was seen in Europe. There was a kind of an emulation of this, but in timber form, the idea of making a frieze or a cornice or elaborating upon the traditional classical architectural details. And simultaneously, you look in the top, we have the cast iron structures that, again, we look at as being historical. This image of downtown Port of Spain, looking north from Marine Square or Independence Square up Frederick Street. On either side of this, some really very important buildings that, again, we see as being historical, these buildings that served trade, that served the merchants who were importing goods into this burgeoning port. But this all happening at a very important moment in time globally. This is an interior view of the Crystal Palace that was constructed in London in the middle of the 19th century, at the sort of, again, at the peak of the sort of colonial British Empire, and comparable expositions taking place in France and elsewhere in the world at the time, where nations were displaying their prowess, their capacity and their expansive capacity to work on a global scale and bring artifacts, to bring trade to and from other places, and to house and accommodate this in really quite special architecture at the time, using cast iron to create spans, using lightweight structures to create large spans, became a really important motif. Gustave Eiffel, the designer of the Eiffel Tower, is from this generation of engineers and architects who are pushing the capacity of the what were then new technologies and new ways of shaping space with new materials for new uses. And it was this type of structure and these types of structures that were then used and exported to the colonies. You know, I know the house in Guadeloupe, in the middle of Guadeloupe, in the middle of Pointe-à-Pitre, that uses this steel frame. John Muir-Lewis produced this very nice sketch showing these structures in Port of Spain using these iron frames. And again, whilst we look at them as being historical and being loaded with the sort of nostalgic value of history, at the time they really were, I think, extraordinarily modern. And you can see from this diagram how these structures and these forms were lightweight in comparison to the sort of stereotomic masonry party walls. They were lightweight structures, but also highly responsive to the environment and to the climate, the way that they captured and used natural light and natural ventilation to aid and to support their function. This is an image I use a lot with students. I think it speaks to, again, firstly, a sense of nostalgia, evoking as it does a particular moment in time, as those early photographs did, but also speaking to, I guess, what we would now call sustainability. If one looks at the image, there is a lovely balance between, you know, the economic, the environmental, and the social. You can see the figures in the upper left from the gallery looking down and enjoying the presence and the action and the activity on the street. The generosity of the merchants in providing those canopies that drop down from the galleries, offering shade to those walking along the very broad sidewalk. And look at the proportion of the space used by cars in comparison to the space that is used by humans, people walking and using the space. The tram lines speak to another system of infrastructure. So we have pedestrian, we have motor cars, we have bicycles, we have the tram. You know, if one looks at really sophisticated contemporary examples of urban infrastructure, such as Barcelona, this is the model that they have really adopted, and that forms a really critical part of the infrastructure that developed within Caribbean society, and in this particular case within Trinidadian society. And these are the buildings. The buildings on the left are the buildings that John Muir-Lewis was drawing and understanding them not just as artifacts, as beautiful historic artifacts, but as functioning quite modern and conceived in quite a modern way, contemporary spaces. So the point here is, I think, that we can read and understand from the city. We can look at the city in a way as a cipher, as a way of understanding history, of a way of understanding heritage, of a way of understanding culture, and also understand manners and modes and ways of resilience. And in this case, how the city evolved as a resilient form. So there are lots of lessons that we can learn from it. And also, I think, the appreciation of the city and of the landscape as having embedded within it messages and lessons and ciphers. This is a map of Trinidad from the 1930s, at a time where the island was moving from being a primarily agricultural place of agricultural produce and agricultural extraction to a place where the extraction of oil and carbon fuels became a really important dimension and aspect to the history and the nature of the island. And I was fortunate enough to work a couple of years ago with my colleague at Cornell, Tao Defu, who's a professor there. We did a project called Landscapes of Extraction, where rather than looking at Trinidad and looking at the island and looking at the city from a sort of nostalgic or morphological way, where we just looked at the architecture and looked at the styles and the different modes of expression, we looked at the whole landscape as being a site of extraction, as a kind of lens through which we might be able to surface new knowledge about the space and extract new ideas. And we came up with some really interesting work that led to further work, and this speaks to the infrastructure of the railway system, and the rail infrastructure derived from the distribution through the landscape to the plantations, to the sugar plantations in central Trinidad, and then to the coffee and cocoa plantations in North Trinidad. And we look at that line going from Port of Spain to San Grande that stopped at all the points where the major estates were, which subsequently constituted and formed the urban agglomeration that subsequently developed. So there's this very interesting linkage between the heritage, in a way, of the infrastructure, not just the built form, and how the society has emerged and how the culture emerged and how the spatial organization of the island of Trinidad in this instance emerged. And I'm sure one could find very similar, in a way, archaeologies, infrastructural archaeologies in other islands and other territories in the Caribbean. Some drawings and some studies that I've produced over the years that look at the evolution and the development of the city, the redirection of the St. Anne's River, and how this modified the form of the city, developing from its laws of the Indies plan that was imposed initially by the Spanish, and that then subsequently, and subject to the different extractive industries, initially agricultural, and then going on to the more the oil-based industries and the more industrialized engagement with the landscape, completely modifying you can see here the coastline with the reclamation of land, and the use and the nature of the space being transformed over time. And again, forming a very, very important part of the understanding of the landscape of Trinidad over time. And again, I think similar studies have been undertaken or could be undertaken for other cities. So we understand this layered and tiered history and the heritage of space, not just through the kind of nostalgic recording of colonial structures, but the cultural, social, economic shifts, the ethnographic shifts that occurred in the evolution and the development of the city over time. And it reminded me, this always reminds me of a very, very significant architect for me, this Aldo Rossi, who speaks of architecture as being the making of the city over time. So if we think of the city as an artifact in and of itself that we need to consider holistically as an artifact of heritage as well as the landscape, architecture really, the individual acts of architecture are not just stylistic examples of technique, but they're elements that contribute to the city. And I think the role of the architect within this and within the appreciation of this historical, this chronological evolution is really important. And in fact, Rossi's work, just as a little digression here, sort of non-Caribbean digression, but it's some important lessons here. Rossi's work came out of, and he founded a movement, became part of a critical movement, I should say, called the Tendenza in Italy, that reacted to this type of architecture. This is the Pirelli Tower by Gio Ponti. And Rossi's generation, I think, were averse to the idea of the Italian landscape being overwhelmed by this universal modernism. And in order to confront it, they were not given commissions, but they used drawing. They used their capacity to imagine, to realize futures that drew from the past. So drawing from the heritage, the classical, the medieval, the rich heritage of architecture in Italy, they drew from that and projected futures that offered an alternative to the rather brutal version of modernity that they felt was represented in buildings such as the Pirelli Tower. So this, I think, speaks to the agency of architecture, the agency of cultural practice, the agency of museum practice in how we shape, model, and imagine the future. And this, another representation of the city of Port of Spain, a photogrammetrics survey, I think, that was produced in the early 70s. My father was a land surveyor. He was the commissioner of lands and surveys for Trinidad and Tobago and was part of this project of mapping the landscape of Trinidad photographically and representing another dimension as to how we see the landscape, and understanding the artifacts or the ways in which we see something informing and shaping how that artifact or how that memory or how that idea is then captured and retained and archived by us. This, I think, image speaking to the kind of industrial expansion of Port of Spain. We see the rail lines, the port, the rapid urbanization, the rural urban drift of people, and the density of the city kind of becoming of a completely different order from the colonial order. You know, what we see here is that the advent of the post-colonial city. And within that context, within that moment of time when Trinidad was imagining itself as a new modern society that existed within a universal context and not subject to colonialism, work like this by the architect Colin Laird, the design for Queen's Hall in the 50s, you know, a demonstration of Trinidad's desire to participate in the future and to have a kind of visionary idea of itself. I think when this building was first displayed in the 50s, it must have appeared like a Zaha Hadid building or a very radical proposition, but something that embodied and contrasted quite starkly with the vernacular architecture that characterized Port of Spain at the moment. And you can see the little sports stand on the right that perhaps speaks to that vernacular. And similarly, the Hilton Hotel, all, you know, another symbol of modernity. And these all being products and artifacts that were modern, that were forward looking at the time, and may seem to contrast with the traditional colonial architecture, but constitute an equally significant and perhaps more immediate and relevant and accessible aspect or dimension of heritage and culture. Some views here of the rather eclectic nature that exists in Port of Spain today, which is neither colonial nor is it exclusively modern, but represents a kind of eclectic and particular and peculiar blend of modernity that I think is something that I have found and experienced in many parts of the Caribbean, where one sees traditional kind of archetypes contrasting with similarities with, but also having similarities with other places. So we see the street scene in Port of Spain, a street scene in Havana, a street scene in Pointe-à-Pitre. There are similarities and also differences, and not just formally, not just as represented in the form of the city or the form or the manifestation of the architecture, but embedded deeply within the active human culture, the way we occupy space, how the city is occupied at certain times, how festivals are practiced, how in this case, obviously an image of the carnival in Trinidad, how people occupy and appropriate the space, I think becomes a really critical way of understanding culture. And a lot of really interesting work undertaken by artists in this that I think perhaps goes unappreciated. It tends to be put in a box marked beauty, but in fact, I think a lot of contemporary artists, many of the contemporary artists that I know, are actively engaged in trying to capture the qualities and values of contemporary life as embodied in experiences such as the experience of carnival, or the experience of recording old forms of carnival. These pictures of Old Mass by Abigail Hadid, I think, evoke really fascinating qualities that speak to this contemporary diversity, this eclectic diversity that constitutes our current condition, that constitutes what will be the heritage of this moment, the lens through which we need to kind of anticipate the memory of the moment. And some more images by some artists, Alex Smales, documenting people enjoying themselves at sort of regular dance and capturing the moment, the mic men from central Trinidad with their cars and their fascination and engagement with sound systems and competing with sound systems. And also in contemporary media, if we look at the history of contemporary media through advertising, the advertising conveying particular and specific values about individual identity, also the individual identity as it relates to space and to the city, and the empowerment that arguably represents. Which brings us to this political dimension and the importance of understanding heritage and history and culture politically. There have been some very critical struggles that our societies have engaged with that seem notably absent, perhaps not in the work of artists, but certainly I think in a lot of the museum work and a lot of curatorial work that I've seen, there's an absence of some of the more difficult or problematic moments in social and political struggle. These images from the archive depicting Port of Spain during the coup in 1990. Again, a moment in history that was catastrophic, but yet curiously is absent from our collective memory and our perception or imaginary of cultural heritage. So I think these are important messages that we need to kind of remember, and they're part of a global phenomenon. We can see here Desmond Bowles' image of the Cecil Rhodes statue being removed from the University of Cape Town, a very political moment in South Africa, where students and many people began to reject the idea of revering colonial figures. And this, of course, presenting really quite an unusual problem. This statue of Robert E. Lee, I believe it's in Richmond, in Virginia, and the move to have it removed, causing quite a lot of kickback from certain sectors of the society, and begging the question: what do we do with artifacts such as this? What do we do with artifacts that represent political or social regimes that were oppressive and that we reject now? How do we deal with heritage in that way? And some interesting projects in Eastern Europe that speak to this. This is the Memento Park in Budapest, where it's become a kind of both a museum and a graveyard from these sort of statues and artifacts of social realism that were scattered all over Eastern European cities, and in this case, Budapest. And what they've done in Budapest is not torn these down and trashed them, although I'm sure many people would like to have done that, but they've removed them from their locations in the center of Budapest and located them in a particular park. So similarly to the way that the animals in the Galerie de l'Evolution were kind of reconditioned and reinterpreted and reappropriated the space that they'd occupied, a similar thing has happened with these artifacts where they've been removed, but they've not been destroyed. So we can go and observe them as artifacts that constitute a significant memory of the city and a memory of the culture and society, but have been displaced from their urban prominence. And I think it's a really interesting project in the way that it speaks to scale in terms of the scale of the city, but also scale in terms of weight and importance of culture and of cultural artifacts. A similar project in Lithuania, in the Grutas Park, where the monuments to Lenin and Stalin have been removed and displaced. So one can go and see them and acknowledge them as significant parts of history, but their preeminence and their dominance within the collective modified to reflect the contemporary views. In the United States, also some significant moves in how this difficult history that has largely been erased from within the sort of contemporary canon of both architectural monumental production as well as perhaps museographic production. Brian Stephen inspired the National Memorial to Peace and Justice, known as the National Lynching Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, a really phenomenal and powerful piece of work that provides a collective space within the city, but also speaks to a heritage, a very difficult heritage, a very problematic heritage, a very violent and brutal heritage, but which now becomes a significant part, constitutes a significant part of the urban life of a particular space and a particular venue. I think some important messages here for us in the Caribbean, where we tend to, I think, look away in a sense from some of the less palatable dimensions of our history. In fact, we still arguably glorify them. I still can't really countenance the idea of calling hotels plantation hotels. You know, it seems to me a really abhorrent idea to go and stay in a plantation hotel. But yet this is somehow still upheld as some sort of motif or nostalgic motif of a grander, more accommodating time, where in fact I think the reality of these moments is really not of that order at all. Mabel Wilson, who worked with Hurl Yoon on the memorial to enslaved laborers at the University of Virginia, another example of how one can capture this idea of heritage in a significant way. I'd like to talk about how architects in different modes also address these issues and draw upon history to create and formulate new ways of working. This is a really interesting project that was undertaken by my friend and colleague Andres Minucci from Puerto Rico, the architect, who worked with some students to develop approaches to emergency housing in Haiti after the earthquake. And you can see here he's drawn upon Jacques Berthelot's typological studies. So Berthelot looking at history, and now Minucci looking at Berthelot's view, his typological view of history, to create a new type of dwelling that satisfied the emergency needs of the population of Haiti at a particular time, and trying to generate spatial order. The idea of the la cour, the courtyard, trying to generate or recreate this mode or this spatial typology in a new form that draws upon a heritage or a cultural tradition that's not just about the style or the surface manifestation, but is about the substantive nature, the formulative structure, the material structure of spaces, drawing upon those and bringing them forward. I think it's a lovely example of how the recording of these cultures and these histories can be reinterpreted and made manifest in contemporary form in very valuable ways. I think it's a beautiful project that speaks to these ideas of heritage and the reinterpretation and reappropriation of heritage into a contemporary context and the spatialization of that. And then some images here of another colleague of mine from Jamaica, Anne Hodges, who works in a very traditional mode, having studied traditional techniques of construction in Jamaica, producing buildings that are clearly historically referential, but reinterpreted and manifest in a contemporary form, evoking qualities of space, qualities of life that are humane, that are scaled, again, that draw upon heritage, but draw upon heritage in a way of reinterpretation. And I'd finally like to close with some images of really a phenomenal architect who passed away many years ago, unfortunately. About 20 years ago, died very young, Roger Turton, who in his work drew upon tradition and craft within Caribbean architecture and reproduced buildings in a highly modern, in a highly modern idiom, in a highly modern way, but always drawing upon the past in order to project imaginary, rich and culturally appropriate futures for everybody, and in a way that would be enjoyed by everybody. And I'd like to finish with this quote by Achille Mbembe, who's here at WITS, advisor at WITS, speaking about decolonization. When he talks about, he talks in this quote about the complexity of modern life, and how many people who exist in the modern life and exist within the sort of the flux and the waves of problems and challenges and issues that face us are often seen as being dispossessed, of having no histories. And I think there's such a wonderful opportunity in space within the Caribbean to use cultural space, to use cultural heritage to invigorate and enliven these histories, and to posit and to pose new memories, to anticipate memory in the work that we do as cultural practitioners. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for all these relevant and urgent reflections. We have our time is up, so I'm going to pass right now back the screen to Joanne.
I want to echo my thanks to Mark and to you too as well, Alex. That was a brilliant talk, and it's one that I think I'll be going back to more than once to listen to again. I want to thank everyone who was in attendance to tonight's keynote address. Please join me in thanking Mark in the chat. A reminder to all registered attendees that our Mix and Sip evening social with House of Angostura begins very shortly. Please go to Speedloop to enter that session. You'll be treated to a drink demonstration and a tour of the Angostura Museum in Trinidad and Tobago. And we hope to see you there and at the sessions tomorrow morning.